I've tried to get this video out so many times already, but Shotbo isn't giving me a break. Help me, guys. Hey guys, it's Shaymin here, and so Shotbo is blowing up. So much has happened in the past 2 weeks, and I plan to release this video in parts, but the news keeps on coming, the hype train isn't slowing, and Jacob Smile really wants to see my analysis on our story. In this video, I'll be talking about various things that have been revealed recently, such as the Our Story analysis, the Origins trailer, a quick word on When in Rogue, and a random sleepy man in an eclipsed outpost. That's a tongue twister, I couldn't manage that on my first try. There's honestly so much stuff to cover that I had no clue where to begin, so I'll just wrap up this intro quickly and move on to whatever I'll be talking about first. Hey, so it turns out I'll be talking about When in Rogue first, since that makes the most sense in terms of the channel. Of course, I'm mainly a MineZ channel, but I think it's important to address the wider Shotbo news, since I know a lot of the MineZ player base have fond memories of When in Rogue. The network owner, HighLifeTTU, who essentially runs the financing of the server, and the very old developer Laser Tester have recently made a return to Shotbo and brought back the beloved game mode When in Rogue. This roguelike dungeon crawler was a very old game mode on the Shotbo network that sadly retired many years ago, but it's finally making a comeback in 2020. The game mode is currently undergoing its alpha testing phase, exclusive to players with a premium account. However, a more public beta is anticipated for release either in 2021 or later this year. Now that we've got When in Rogue out of the way, let's get on to the interesting stuff. Let's get on to the MineZ stuff, and I'm deciding to do the quickest part right off the bat, and that would be the newest MineZ teaser, which is called Wake Up. Now, I know that at first glance, to most people, the teaser might seem a little... But rest assured, as I, among others, was able to pick out a few neat little details about this fairly simple-seeming teaser. This video shows a pretty scruffy-looking man dozing off right in the middle of an Eclipse stronghold, only it's not just any Eclipse stronghold. We've seen this place in particular before. In fact, this place is exactly the same place as one of the teaser images I showed in my most recent video. Though it does seem odd that this random person is just lounging in the middle of an eclipsed location. I will get onto this thought a little later on in the video, but maybe the Eclipsed are less of a cult and more of just a collective group with set ideals, which would explain why this guy in particular isn't dressed up in red robes, which is the typical attire that we've seen for Eclipsed members. I think another interesting thing to note is that this guy doesn't appear to have any weapons on him, so he's definitely not a guard, and no, this isn't a limitation of armor stands either, because you can give armor stands arms using commands, and therefore they can hold weapons. This leads me to believe that this individual will probably be an NPC that we can interact with. Maybe he'll just say some stuff to us, or maybe he's a quest giver, which is something that has been hinted at in previous Shotbo roadmaps years ago before all the latency issues on the server. That just about wraps up the stuff about the Wake Up teaser, so let's talk about the main meat of the video, that being MineZ Our Story. This mini-series on the Shotbo YouTube channel is focused on the events leading up to the present day in the MineZ lore. And yes, you heard that correctly, Our Story essentially serves as the official timeline of MineZ. Now, I will admit, there is a lot of in-your-face information provided in Our Story in order to cater to those with less understanding of the MineZ lore, since Our Story is meant to sort of serve as an introduction to the MineZ lore, rather than something more in-depth for the established players. However, I was able to find a lot of cool little pieces of information, trivia, and secrets within the Our Story teasers, so I will be summarizing every episode and pointing out all the interesting stuff worthy of note that I actually noticed. I'm sure even I missed a bunch of details, since this series is about 20 minutes in combined total length and is filled with information. So, I'll just run through it as best I can, and yeah, without further ado, let's get into the prefacing episode of MineZ Our Story.
In the beginning there was one, and he was known as Hestrel.
As you can probably figure out by that intro, Episode 0 is essentially the book of Genesis of MineZ. In this introductory part of our story, we get introduced to Hestrel and the four gods, who are described to be the creations of Hestrel himself. Basically, to sum the episode up, Hestrel created the universe and the stars within his creation, then realized there wasn't much besides these stars and created the four gods using part of himself. The resultant loss in a portion of Hestrel's brilliance resulted in the events to follow, but in the meantime the four elemental gods created the world that we know. This episode is really cool because it introduces our main characters right off the bat, and we also get to see their symbols in the video. Now, this is really good for players just getting into the lore, because now whenever they head out into the world, they'll see these symbols around and be like, oh, Theron's here. Cool. There are a few things to note in this episode, secret-wise. First of all, Agni is described not just as the god/goddess of fire, but also as
God and goddess over the flames of life.
When I watched this the first time, I was excited to see whether the other gods had been given any additional aspects, such as Pluvia being the god of wisdom. However, we got no such reference. We did, however, though, we got this.
Shaymin, god of the wind.
Apparently, the god we've been calling Shaymin all this time is actually pronounced Simun. That's gonna be hard to get used to. The other takeaway from this episode is that we also have a hint of what's to come.
However, this creation weakened Hestrel, who had lost a portion of his brilliance.
By stating that Hestrel lost a part of his brilliance in the very first episode, that marks this fact as an important event which we should keep in mind for the future episodes. This does mirror the pre-Origins MineZ lore, and I'm actually kind of glad to see that they kept the baseline MineZ lore intact, so it's a very similar main storyline to what we already know. The build team could have gone ahead and rewritten the lore entirely and just retconned everything, but instead they stuck to their guns and preserved the old lore in this particular circumstance, which I think was the right move, because they're not removing the story people like myself know and love, and instead we can just move forward from the promising skeleton of the old lore. After all, it would be very difficult to invest in all new lore with the same old characters when I would be stuck with memories of what the lore I'm so attached to used to be like.
Rising from the molded, fresh earth, humanity was created to rule over all other earthly creations.
In episode 1 of MineZ Our Story, we learn about the rise of humanity and their main settlements they utilized before the plague, those being Axis Mundi, created by the gods themselves, Agni Ignis, constructed using the magic bestowed to the humans by the gods, and Grimdale, which would later become the capital city. There's not much of interest in this episode, but there are still a few things I want to note. First of all, let's talk about this.
Here existed a tether between Hestrel's domain and our own. Some humans were even granted dominion over the elements themselves.
This was the moment when humanity was first given access to magic by the gods. In other words, the humans that received the ability to wield magic by the gods were the first mages to walk the realm, and as we know, the first mages settled in Agni Ignis. However, I don't actually think necromancers were mentioned anywhere in our story, so maybe necromancer will be renamed, who knows? Another interesting thing referenced in Our Story episode 1 is Hestrel's domain, which I think is probably the most interesting mystery of the episode. Perhaps Hestrel's domain is the origin, which could only be accessed through Axis Mundi during this time. However, since Axis Mundi fell into the ground and lost its magic, we'll probably have to find a different way to access Hestral's domain in the Origins update, and that is if we're even able to do so. One final thing I just want to clarify is the mention of Grimdale.
On the southwest shores near the swamp, what would one day be our capital, Grimdale was founded.
It is stated that Grimdale was the main base of operations during the era of humanity, but I want to avert any misconceptions here right from the get-go. Just because Grimdale would later become the capital of humanity does not mean that it was the capital from the beginning. When Grimdale was first built, it was merely a small city. The humans just made Grimdale their capital when they went to war with the gods. I just thought this was important to mention.
Humanity flourished under the guidance of the elemental gods, yet from his seat in the heavens, Hestral sensed what the others could not. A deep, sinister feeling brewing in this new creation, humanity.
In this episode, we learn that Hestral basically went on a genocide out of pure paranoia. He sensed that some of his humans he had created were dabbling in dark magic and decided to purge swathes of the humans off the face of the earth as a result. The other four gods were worried about what Hestral would do to the humans, so they sealed Hestral away in his domain and threw away the keys. Though humanity was safe from the wrath of Hestral now that he'd been placed in an eternal slumber, the absence of the creator god's magic caused Axis Mundi to sink into the ground. The subject of this episode in particular is interesting to me because it implies that Hestral wasn't necessarily corrupted or evil, but rather he feared the dark magic humans were delving into and wanted to prevent their studies into whatever this dark magic may have been. The narrator says this:
Mages tainted by some darkness Hestral did not desire in his creation.
Which alerted me to the fact that this magic was likely not of Hestral's creation. So where did it come from? Well, there's two likely possibilities. Either this magic was created entirely by accident, or this dark magic came directly from Dentral. Though Dentral's role is not yet explained at this point in the series, and we don't quite know where Dentral came from, it is obvious that Dentral does still exist with the new lore. And it's also quite apparent at this point that Dentral is no longer just the alter ego of Hestral. The fact that Hestral even recognized the dark magic as evil indicates that Hestral at least was aware of Dentral's existence. And if that's the case, these are the first signs of many indications of Dentral's presence within the world of MineZ.
To protect their creations, they would seal away that which had given them life. He was placed in his domain, from which all creation had flourished, and that realm was locked away, the great god being placed into an eternal slumber.
Now, I didn't notice this fact when I watched episode 2 the first time, but the narrator states that Hestral was locked away into his realm and put into a slumbering state. I want you to keep this particular point in mind, because it will definitely come up later on.
With Hestral gone, humanity rejoiced at their second chance, thanking the elemental gods.
I'm sorry to say that if you thought the humans were out of the woods yet, you'd be sorely mistaken. The gods, in the absence of Hestral's light, became unstable and unpredictable, to the point where they simultaneously revoked their previous relationship with humanity. Instead of trying to help their creations and nurture them, the gods now sought to dominate, and they did so by manipulating the elements to plunge humanity into chaos. This is why the lakes in what is now the gravel wasteland were drained, and why a town called Frostbane is now in the middle of a wintry tundra. Some of the humans bowed to the gods, hoping to lessen their wrath, whereas others sought to take back their world and rebel against the gods that were once their allies. The gods caught on to this uprising, and in response, they sent a meteor to utterly annihilate the town of Joni A as a warning to the humans. It does make sense that in the absence of Hestral, the gods would become quote-unquote corrupted, though not corrupted by Dentril, so it seems. The reason for this is that part of Hestral resides within all four of the gods, which is why a fraction of Hestral's brilliance was missing in the first place. If the gods were destabilized by Hestral's banishment, then the fact that their instinct to protect, altered into an instinct to control, would not be too hard to believe. Let's talk about the canyons now. This is something very similar to the old lore, but at least it's confirmed in this particular clip
The great northern lakes, gifts from Pluvia, were drained.
that the canyons below the gravel plateaus used to be filled with water. This would mean that Abandoned Farm, if it is still on the map in Origins, which I think it definitely will be, would have been built there after episode 3 of our story, probably in a futile bid to grow food in whatever water was left in the riverbed after the water drained. Now, here's the most interesting part of episode 3, to me at least.
We were desperate, and we were alone. Some offered a solution, a way to end this torment and this age of fear that we had lived in for too long.
Obviously, most of the renders and clips shown on the screen during the Our Story videos haven't been the direct subject of discussion at that particular part of the video, but something tells me that the eclipsed ruins being shown here isn't a coincidence. When the narrator says some offered a solution, he's likely referencing the eclipsed and their desire to seal away the gods, just like they also sealed away Hestral. And he's talking about them in a positive light as well. If these people who offered the solution were the eclipsed, we now know when they were founded. Another speculation I had, which, to be honest, I'm kind of pulling at straws for this one, but I'm wondering if the narrator of Our Story is actually the sleepy man we see in the Wake Up teaser. It's very unlikely. But I think it would be part of a cool connection between the two. And also, when I was recording this video and gathering all the footage, I did notice that the Wake Up teaser is part of the Our Story playlist, so it's not completely possible after all.
Whispers in the dark, hushed voices in corners. They spoke of an option, one that would free us and preserve our way of life.
Now, this is where things start to get very interesting. After humanity as a collective race was punished with the destruction of Joni A due to a minority of rebels, the humans gathered in the newly declared capital of Grimdale to prepare their battle plan against the gods. Using a deep and primal magic, they would seal away the four gods in massive sealing stones, placing them in a meditative state to allow them to reflect on their actions against humanity. It seemed like everything would go uphill from there, but I just want to point out that we're not even halfway through the series yet. This episode starts right off the bat with something very big. This episode starts straight away with something big. The whispers in the dark and the voices in the corners were of those who told the humans to construct the spires. Considering that only the gods at this point had knowledge of how to seal away another god, because, I mean, they did so with Hestral, it seems unlikely that any of the humans gathered at Grimdale would miraculously have the blueprints for the spires that sealed the gods away. Unless these people were some very sophisticated mages who had spoken to the gods before in a place like Axis Mundi, humans would not know how to perform such a task. What I'm getting at here is that the voices that spoke of the solution to the god's wrath must have been another god. And that god would have been Dentril. Because Hestral is now gone, there would have been very little of his light left in the world. The only remaining light would have been that belonging to Agni, Simoon, Therum, and Pluvia. As Hestral's influence on the world decreased, it is possible that Dentril's influence increased, which is why he is now able to whisper to the humans of the realm. One thing that did surprise me about this episode of Our Story is that the narrator says this.
With bated breath, we watched every day as those spires stretched higher into the sky.
Now this suggests that all four of the spires were built above towers just like the fire spire was. However, we get no explanation in our story as to why the wind spire is underground and the earth spire is in the middle of the floating islands. I like to think that each of the spires were constructed with their location in mind so that they would be out of their element. So the fire spire is surrounded by a moat of water, the water spire is freezing over, the earth spire is levitating far from any stable ground, and the wind spire is trapped below the surface of the earth. However, it is possible that maybe they crumbled apart as a result of the absence of the god's magic after the banishment, or maybe when we get Origins, the spires will just receive rebuilds and they'll all look more intact than they are now. Also, the present fire spire looks really tacky. Seriously, we need a rebuild. Give it to us.
What fools we were, to think we could remove the gods and come out unscathed.
Episode 5 is when we learn that, in a cruel twist of fate, the gods released the plague into the world, starting from Romero, as one final act of revenge against humankind. Not only had the gods' banishment dampened the magic within the world, rendering the previously wonderful powers of the mages almost useless, but the citizens of Romero afflicted with this new disease would rise up in undeath after succumbing to it in life. This is where the Z and MineZ all started, guys. We've got it right here. Word spread around the world like wildfire, and soon enough the scientists working in the labs at Byersford Castle caught wind of the happenings in Romero, and many of them hurried over to Romero to prevent the highly infectious disease from spreading throughout the world. In an attempt to contain this new zombie plague, a perimeter was erected around the city, but it was unfortunately all in vain. The zombies had become too widespread, the city was overrun, and we get these haunting final words from the final parts of episode 5.
Romero, one of the largest cities in the world, had succumbed to the dead.
Oh god. There isn't much hidden in this episode as far as I can tell, but it's nice how they're keeping the whole story connected. The reason why Romero was so easily overrun is because a whole flock of refugees from the Joni A incident who had evacuated after the whole meteor thing were flooding into the city from the Continental Bridge. Not all of them got in because a section of the bridge got blown up, which is actually why this part of the bridge around spawns 29 and 30 is resting on the ground, but those who did make it to Romero were defenseless, they were weak, and they were easy pickings for the undead.
Romero had fallen. Any citizen that hadn't been evacuated was left for dead in those forsaken walls.
Episode 6 is probably one of my top 3 favorite Our Story episodes. In this episode, we focus on the scientists at Byersford Labs who are desperately attempting to discover a cure while the plague ravaged the southern coasts of the world. While the world held its breath, awaiting for a response, the scientists had gone quiet. The survivors anxiously waited for news they would never receive directly from man, but the inhabitants of Chromia were the first to discover the product of what went on in the labs. The Pigman, a horrifying abomination which seemed to be neither human nor undead, became the new ace card of the undead onslaught and rapidly accelerated the destruction of the world's northwestern settlements. If you don't realize what this means, it means we get a Pigman origin story. Hooray! This episode doesn't tell us anything new. All of the things brought up in this episode were part of the old lore. Before the Great Retconning, pigmen were the product of various experiments at Byersford Labs in an attempt to find a cure for the plague. So not much changed, only in the old lore the scientists actually did find the cure, however they all got killed off by their creation before they could release the news out to the rest of the world. I'm actually wondering if there are a finite number of pigmen out there, or whether all the pigmen in the world are directly from Byersford Labs. It would certainly surprise me if a beast that mutilated that had multiple mini-zombies living inside of it would be able to reproduce, but this is the wonderful wacky world of MineZ, so anything's possible. The big question of this episode is whether the scientists at Byersford Labs actually discovered the cure like in the old lore, or whether that actually didn't happen. Of course it wouldn't matter since the cure would have never gotten out anyway, but I'm just curious, and I'm sure a few people are going to go to Byersford Labs to try the dungeon and see if anything has changed there as part of Origins.
Great swaths of undead rolled across the towns of the southeast and northwest.
As the undead spread throughout the world, it really seemed like humanity was breathing its last breath. Many lost hope as zombies swept through settlement to settlement. Those in the far east of the world were forced to move north in hopes of making contact with the forgotten mages of Agni Ignis, whereas the remaining human population was called back to Grimdale in order to prepare for the troubling times to come. Many towns and cities were abandoned or overrun, and the resources available to humans declined by the day. This episode is really awesome to me because despite the horrible situation going on and the feeling of finality we're getting to, it tells us that the humans aren't ready to give up hope just yet. They still believe that the mages who were once committed to the gods were still out there somewhere, hopefully able to aid in the fight against the undead, while the others believe that the capital city would serve as their sanctuary and stronghold and see them through the apocalyptic events of the outside world. I'm going to move on to episode 8 pretty quick, which is a trend you might have noticed for the past few episodes, but before I do that, I just want to point out that the decision to recall the humans to Grimdale is an absolutely stupidly ridiculous decision. Not only do the humans not yet fully understand how long the disease manifests itself within people before showing symptoms, but if every single human is cooped up in the city, how are they ever going to get the resources from the outside world? Like, I get it, they need to be together so that they can defend one another, but how are they going to get their food? How are they going to get coal for fire? How are they going to get the necessary resources to feed the hungry mouths of the majority of the surviving human population? Not to mention that in a place this crowded, if one person gets the disease, everyone is going to get the disease. Honestly, no wonder those people in the East would rather head up to a place they're not even sure existed anymore.
With our vast world now being inhabited by the undead, the only remaining seat of power sat at Grimdale.
Humanity was at its breaking point, and most of the world had now become inhabited by the undead. Grimdale, which had been the capital since before the banishment, would now serve as the focal point of the humans' battle against the undead. Sadly, this battle was short-lived. Though the town was managed reasonably well considering the problems discussed a few moments ago, the refugees that were not allowed into the city became the undoing of the remaining bundle of humanity. The only entrance to Grimdale, which was heavily guarded by its inhabitants, rejected zombies and refugees alike until the refugees dying of disease and famine managed to make their way into the city through a weak mound of dirt under one of the walls. Where the refugees went, the zombies followed, and soon enough, the guards found that the undead were pouring into their city through this newly opened hole. In a panicked state, one of the guards attempted using bombs to blow the hordes away, but the resultant blast destroyed the wall and allowed greater hordes to swarm into the city en masse. Grimdale would be overrun within minutes, and humanity's last stand would be a failure. All of this would not have happened if the refugees were allowed into the city, but there is a very important reason as to why they weren't. Surprisingly, the reason doesn't seem to be overpopulation, but instead it seems the refugees were not allowed into the city because, from the perspective of the guards, they appeared to be still living hosts of the zombie disease. Even if these refugees didn't have the plague and were simply sick from a completely separate disease, the guards did not want to risk allowing an infected host into Grimdale. It wasn't just the refugees' fault though. What kind of moron decides to chuck bombs at a wall you're trying to block off? Like, what is the thought process there? I'm honestly convinced that this man is probably single-handedly the reason why spawn grenades don't work in the South.
With no major opposition, the dead continued to roll over the land. In only a few short weeks, our world had been ravaged by the dead.
Ooh, finally, we've got an episode where we can get back to some good old theory crafting. This episode, along with the final episode, are probably my two favorite episodes of the Our Story series for one major reason. The players of MineZ have been incorporated into the new lore of the game. When the narrator mentions this...
The survivors, however, became bolder, venturing back into lost cities for any resources left, food, water, supplies, all precious commodities worth more than gold. And life, apparently.
He's actually referencing the people who play the game of MineZ. Now, we all know that many of MineZ's features, such as respawning and the PvE border, are not actually canon to the lore of MineZ. However, it does make sense that the people who play the game are the embodiment of the survivors of the world who have returned to the towns in order to seek loot and supplies. Besides these few survivors and scavengers that remained, the rest of the world had kind of crashed and burned. The mages of the world had gone missing, Agni Ignis was now completely barren of life, and the wizard tower was stuck in some kind of perpetual explosion. The absence of magic had weakened them into a state where they were essentially regular humans, and so they had been slaughtered either by the undead or by their own failing magic. Even the world itself began to fall apart, with a gaping ravine opening up near Fort Erie. In fact, the quite literal falling apart seems to be a theme with the upcoming MineZ Origins update. Looking at the teaser post on the Shopbo forum, we can see that Agni Ignis appears to have sunken into the ground, or another ravine similar to the one in the tundra has opened up right next to it. Even the font used in the teaser looks all crumbly and decayed. This episode of Our Story, along with the teaser we've seen for Origins, essentially confirms that due to the absence of the god's magic, the world is falling apart. This leads me back to the theory I had way back with episode 4 of Our Story, where I speculated that the narrator might be a member of the Eclipsed. He's obviously very aware of the world collapsing as a result of the absence of magic, yet it's clear at this point that the Eclipsed were the ones interested in sealing away the gods in the first place. If they're trying to seal away the gods in MineZ Origins, knowing full well that the world will destroy itself as a result, then it may actually be possible that the Eclipsed will end up being the bad guys of MineZ Origins, and we will have to side with the gods in order to defeat them. Oh, that would be a cool twist.
It could have always been there, yet no one could tell you much about the odd structure.
Yep, you guessed it, Dentrol is finally getting a name drop. While the apocalypse had been going down and the zombies had been sweeping the land, nobody had ever come across the Shrine of the Dusk. Not until the present day, the pre-Origins update, which is when Our Story episode 10 takes place. The timeless cathedral must have been built by someone, but no one remembers it. Word of it was never passed down, and the shrine was forgotten to history. However, this dark cathedral was the resting place of Dentrol, the dark god, and an ancient evil rivaled only in power by the other gods. The humans who discovered Dentrol's seal set him free, being promised fortune and glory, but after realizing their mistake, they quickly reconstructed the seal, keeping Dentrol locked away in the depths of the dark cathedral. The number of theories I have for this finale episode of Our Story surpasses that of any other episode I've analyzed so far, and there was also a little cool nod to the Hassa PvP community in this episode.
As seasons passed, survivors became more curious, leaving behind the bloodshed beneath those plateaus.
Since we've got a long theory to go through, let's get into it. I'll start by discussing who Dentrol is and how I think he came to be. Dentrol is the dark, corrupting god of MineZ. In the old lore, Dentrol was the alter ego of Hestrel. When Hestrel split a part of his brilliance from himself and shared it with Agni, Pluvia, Simoon, and Therum, he began to develop Dentrol as a second aspect of himself. Eventually, the two split apart into separate entities, went absolutely insane, and started just destroying everything. I think that in the new lore, Dentrol will serve less as an alter ego, but more as a counterbalance of Hestrel's light. In the beginning, we can safely assume that Hestral was the only being, and his brilliance was whole because he had not created the other four gods. However, when he split a fraction of his brilliance, we can reasonably assume that Dentril took form and gained power equivalent to the fraction of power Hestral was missing. I now want you to remember the dark magic which drove Hestral into paranoia back in episode 2 of our story. It's likely that with the limited power Dentril had at this point, he bestowed dark magic to the humans just like the other gods had given humans their own magic. However, his influence wasn't far-stretching like the other gods, and so he could only gather followers locally. It's possible that Shrine of the Dusk was constructed during this time by Dentril's followers, and started playing around with dark magic, which alerted Hestral and prompted his killing rampage. This would be why Shrine of the Dusk was one of the best kept secrets in the MineZ world up until the present day. It's because any human who would have memory of the cathedral was wiped off the face of the earth during Hestral's purge of humanity. It's also likely that during this time, Hestral sealed away Dentril with the other four gods' help, which is probably why the other four gods were so good at sealing Hestral away when he flew off the handle. It's because they practiced beforehand with Dentril. I do want you to think back to something else I said now, which is also in episode 2. I mentioned that you should take note of the fact that the narrator said that Hestral was placed into a deep slumber in his domain.
To protect their creations, they would seal away that which had given them life. He was placed in his domain, from which all creation had flourished, and that realm was locked away, the great god being placed into an eternal slumber.
However, we don't know which state Dentril was sealed in. We know that Agni, Simoon, Pluvia, and Therum were ripped from the heavens and sealed in our own realm in a meditative state, meaning that they would be awake instead of in a slumber like Hestral, so it's possible that Dentril is sealed below the ground in a meditative state just like the other four. They're all definitely awake, as the four gods communicate with the player if they unlock Dentril's seal in Shrine of the Dusk, despite being sealed away. And let me remind you that Dentril was likely the whispers in the dark that prompted the humans to build the spires. This would all be part of Dentril's grand plan. In making the humans think that they were being saved from the four gods' wrath, they were actually helping Dentril by removing all opposition, so that one day some weak-minded humans would succumb to his brainwashing and release him from his prison, allowing him to be free and conquer the realm with no gods to protect their creation from the terrible fate he would bring. Those weak-minded humans who Dentril uses to unshackle himself from his seal were the players. Yes, the Eclipse have visited the excavated ruins of the ancient city of Helia, which were below Shrine of the Dusk, and that would explain why their flag can be found hidden throughout the dungeon, but even the Eclipsed did not dare to delve further into the silent expanse that is the grave of the Dark God. Okay, this is definitely going to be the longest video I'm ever going to edit. Good grief, this took way too long. Like, I don't regret it whatsoever. This was a blast to do, but editing for a solid 12 hours would just take it out of anyone. Origins is really damn close, and you better believe that I'm on the hype train, but I'm probably gonna need a break before I can get onto the Origins teaser trailer. I'm really sorry about this, but hey, we've probably got a couple more weeks before Origins comes out, so... What? What? Huh? What? No way! What? Yeah, I'm gonna need to speak to whoever's driving this train. If you've made it this far into the video, I've got to give you props, because this is probably going to be the longest video that's not a live stream that I'll ever do on the channel. And I'm not lying when I say this, but this video took me 12 hours to produce and has 7,000 words in it, So it means a whole heck of a lot to me if you made it this far into the video. It really makes my time worth it, even if a few of you guys make it all the way. So if you comment something like beef teriyaki, it's what I had for dinner the other day, by the way, I'll know that you've made it this far, and I'll be a very happy bunny. All of the footage and clips I've used in this video that aren't my own, or the outro for that matter, which is by CatSage, are on the Shotbow YouTube channel, and I've got a link to those two down below, so you can check them out. I am also going to be working on an analysis of the Origins trailer after a good night's sleep once this video goes live, and also on Origins release day. I'll be doing a live stream and kind of touring the world for whatever new builds, secrets, or lore we might find. So make sure you're around for that. Anyway, that's enough of my rambling. I've kept you guys here way too long already. So I'm gonna say thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed, and I really hope to see you again soon.